Here's the bottom line. We see what's going on here. We're not happy about it. You are a sovereign nation, but your actions have impinged upon our sovereignty in many respects. And therefore, here's the facts. You have two operational Gripens and one qualified pilot. We have 3,700 fighter planes. You have one operational cruiser. We have 400 ship Navy. You have no operational submarines. We have 45 nuclear submarines. We have 1.3 million troops on active duty. Now, you can continue to be a sovereign nation, do what you want. This is a private conversation, by the way. This wouldn't be something that would be shared with the public. But if you continue to act against U.S. interests and continue to do what you're doing, then there will be consequences.
My guest is Colonel Chris Wyatt. In my mind, I actually had a meeting with you tomorrow, Chris. This is the way I wrote it down. And I got a message from somebody via Facebook to tell me that, no, in fact, I had a meeting with you, or supposed to have a meeting with you a few hours ago. So let's start this discussion with me making a very sincere apology to you, to apologize for not pitching for the meeting that you thought I had with you today. Somehow this mix-up that we've had. Welcome to the program anyway.
Well, thank you very much. No need to apologize. These things happen. So we won't talk from the past or the future. We're somewhere in between in the present. So our meeting for tomorrow is taking place now. So yeah, no, don't worry about that. That happens. When I was in South Africa recently, I was expected to do an interview with the DJ Sabu, and I got there and DJ Sabu was on Africa time, or at least West Africa time. And so our meeting that was supposed to started an hour and 20 minutes late. I had scheduled a meet and greet with my viewers over at Prison Break in Four Ways. And I felt horrible. I was an hour and 20 minutes late for that. And people waited for me. So kind of them, so generous of them. And so I stayed as long as they wanted me to. I stayed for hours after that. We actually closed down the restaurant on that day. But no, don't worry about it. It happens. Scheduling conflicts, confusion, especially when you're doing a lot. So no harm, no foul. My concern earlier was that I said, I hope something hasn't happened to the guy. I mean, your interest in talking to me seemed genuine. You actually called me old school. You paid for a phone call on your mobile. It wasn't even a WhatsApp. So I didn't think that you had disrespected or dismissed me. I just thought that something might have happened. So we're good to go. Let's get rolling.
No, I sincerely wanted to talk to you. In fact, as you mentioned, now I sent you an email about a month or so ago. And as you now noted back to me, you did not see the interview request that I sent. I thought you're just a terribly busy guy and might not have time for me. So I'm really very happy to meet you. You've just done a tour of South Africa. Let's start there. Tell me about this visit to South Africa that you've just had now. What have you experienced? What have you done? What was the purpose of the tour? Tell me all about it.
Well, it's fascinating, Johan. So I've been in South Africa hundreds of times over the past 30 years. I've lived, of course, all over Africa and right next door in Botswana. And so I would go to South Africa almost every weekend, to be honest, and frequently for business as well during the week. So when I retired from active duty in the Army in October 2019, I started a consultancy to try to get American businesses to invest in Africa so that we're not a second-rate economic power in the year 2050. I'd like my golden years to be wealthy years, and I don't want America to be an also-ran country. And Africa is the next big thing in my view. That's where the growth is coming. That's where the consumer class is going to be 900 million by the year 2050. And American companies, by and large, except for the big ones, are missing out. They're not paying attention. There's no Verizon over there. There's no Xfinity over there. And that's a huge mistake in my mind. Anyway, so I started this consultancy and I started making videos to promote it because COVID came along and I couldn't travel. I had booked a couple trips to Africa for businesses, introducing people in Senegal and Ghana, and it just fell apart. So I was sitting at home and I didn't want to balloon up to 400 pounds, so I exercised every day and I didn't want my mind to go to waste either because my stock and trade is my analytical ability, my ability to communicate and analyze things. So I started making videos about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, counterterrorism in the Sahel, about SADC, about SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, things like that. And I went on my LinkedIn profile, which had about 9 or 10,000 followers, because I used to post a lot of news stories with commentary in there. So I was promoting Africa for years while I was on active duty. As a lot of my social media stuff had to be prescribed and circumspect. I couldn't just do anything. I was a serving intelligence officer in the Army, and you can't just do anything on social media. So most of what I did was just analytical things on LinkedIn. I didn't mess with other social media, even though I had accounts there. So I started making these videos, and it just caught on. Next thing I know, in 4 months, I went from with a 15-year-old channel, 2 to 23,000 subscribers. And about half my audience was based in South Africa, and I had a global audience. So it was fascinating. YouTube took my channel away, and then I came back with another channel. By the way, I never never violated the community standards. They just attacked me, and they restored my channel 23 months later, but the damage was done. And so the what happened is that a lot of South Africans are like, "Hey, when are you coming to South Africa?" I'm like, "Well, there's COVID. I can't travel. There's travel restrictions." So there was a lot of pent up interest in me coming to South Africa. And so the first chance I got when they eased the COVID travel restrictions was in August of 2022. Since August 2022, I've made 5 trips to South Africa. And they average about every 6 months. Although this was a 1 year gap, because last year I foolishly ran for the state legislature and refused donations and used my life savings, not all of it, but used my life savings to pay for my campaign out of pocket so that no one could claim I was bought. I'm an independent person. That is money I would normally have spent on another trip to South Africa. Plus, I had some physical ailment with my hip. It was bothering me. So it's been a year stretch. I was there last year for the elections. I went to 14 polling stations in the Western Cape. I started at Somerset West, went to 5 polling stations in Khayelitsha, then Monenberg, Sea Point, Rondebosch, Parklands, Tableview, Milnerton, all these places. And so these trips started in 2022 as a payback to my audience. They wanted to see me, meet with me. People were fascinated. They wanted to hear about my experiences and just get to know me and say hi. And so that was the intent. So the first trip in August 2022, I was there for 30 days and I did 17 meet and greets in 6 provinces across the country. It was all self-funded. Now, to be fair and honest, my favorite South African saying, which I think is kind of silly, is "if I'm honest," because what else would you be? But if I'm honest, that trip was helped in no small measure because people offered accommodation. And actually had someone who sponsored a couple of my hotel stays, and others offered the accommodation. I'm not comfortable staying with people, but I grew to get a little more comfortable with it, and
Yeah.
so that cut down my costs somewhat. But still, I spent about $7,000 on that trip for rental cars, flights, and accommodations and things like that. Anyway, so that was what the trip was. I would go there. I filmed a documentary on the Goed Constantia vineyard, the oldest still in operation. Went there, met with the CEO, and we did a documentary on that, about 20 minutes. And so I also gave public lectures like at the Reformation Society in Rondebosch and did meet and greets and then met my viewers and traveled around. Got a lot of stock footage for things that I cover and also covered events as they unfolded. That's kind of how these trips have played out since then. The subsequent trips, there was less interest. I had fewer people show up and meet and greets, and that's fine. If nobody shows up, it's just me, I'll eat dinner.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it went. That's what happened in Eiserfontein last year. Nobody showed up at Eiserfontein. 7 people said they're coming. It was just me. But this trip was just off the hook, completely different, Johan. The refugee program has really changed things. My channel, which had suffered a lot of shadow banning on YouTube and been hidden, and my subscribers frequently get unsubscribed. If you don't see someone's videos pop up on your For You, you tend to forget about things, even if you like a channel.
Yeah.
And so my viewership was stagnant, and I reached 20,000 subscribers on the newer channel after 2 years and 8 months, compared to the original channel, which had 23,000 in 5 months.
Yeah.
So I just realized it's going to be a small channel, but people rely on me for the news and my analysis, so I'll just keep doing it. And then as middle of January came, Trump was about to come back in office. I know a lot of South Africans are curious about Trump, even though my channel is not a South African channel, it's a global channel, but that was half my audience. So I started making videos about Trump and what's going to happen in the election. Then he came in, the channel grew, and the subscriber base grew. Next thing I know, I've gone over 100,000 subscribers in May. So that's pretty exciting stuff. I haven't received my little silly YouTube plaque yet. I suppose if I get it, I've threatened to use a 12 gauge and go in the woods and blow it apart.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I would like to do is I would like to talk to you about your the evolution of your understanding and your relationship with South Africa.
Sure.
I'd like to talk about what you saw, what you learned, what you knew about South Africa the first time you were introduced to the country. So we can do this on a timeline as well. When
Sure.
was that? What is it that drew you to South Africa or took you to South Africa or perked your interest in South Africa? And then I think I would like to talk to you about how that evolved over the years. So let's start with that. For the first time that South Africa became part of your environment.
Well, for me, that would be the 1970s when I was a young man. What was happening in the 1970s is that I had gone from various different states of living in abject poverty to upper middle class, back to abject poverty. Not through any actions of my own. I was a kid, It's just you go where the family takes you, and lots of things happened during that time frame, including living in projects, being a minority in a housing project of 300 black families, 3 whites, living in a poor portion of Buffalo, New York, where everybody spoke Spanish. Oddly, they were all Puerto Rican. Buffalo, New York is freezing, by the way. I don't understand why people from the Caribbean would move to Buffalo, but and so I lived in all different kind of circumstances. And while all this was happening, I developed an interest in history. I didn't have much of anything, and then I wound up on a dairy farm
At
running a
what
dairy.
point, Chris, just at what point?
Yeah.
It's at high school level, university level, college level? Where are we now?
So we're middle school level.
Middle
So
school level.
after primary
Okay.
school is
That's
where
a
my
good
interest
start.
in so that's where my
Okay.
history interest in
Yeah.
history began in mid
Okay.
70s, I would say.
Yeah.
And this is shortly after the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. And so Angola and Mozambique are cut loose. And of course, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, but that's a different story. So we're focused on Southern Africa. And so Soldier of Fortune magazine was a big thing back then. And you go to the libraries at school and it would be there along with all the other news magazines. And I would read them and what's going on. And I found it fascinating. And I developed an interest in military history and military and in Europe. And and then I transitioned to high school as I watched these things. I read a book by Jim Stockdale. I think no, it's John Stockdale. It's right there. Actually, I got another copy of it 40 years later. John Stockwell about not Stockwell. He was a former CIA agent, and he talked about how he left Vietnam and went in and supported Holden Roberto and the FNLA in Angola. I found it fascinating, very interesting. So I read that book, and that increased my interest, and I started reading more Soldier of Fortune and focusing more on Southern Africa and Mozambique. And then the South African intervention, which had occurred in 75 timeframe, 76 timeframe, all that had just been recent. So I go to high school at this point, and then I came across a book written by someone who became my favorite author, my favorite fictional author, and that was James Michener. He wrote a book called The Covenant.
Hmm.
So I recently found out that maybe it was ghostwritten. But anyway, James Michener, The Book of the Covenant. So The Covenant is about the Gelofte Dag and the Day of the Vow. That's where the title comes from. But the book is of the entire history of South Africa, historical fiction with actual historical figures and characters interwoven to tell a story.
Okay.
And so at the end of that 1,200 page fine print paperback book, I came to the conclusion that, wow, what an incredibly interesting but screwed up country South Africa is. I'm
Okay.
hooked.
Okay.
And
So,
so
so that's
yeah.
that's just for my own clarity. That was your first introduction to the Afrikaner people as well.
Well, to the people, yes, but to South African history, I'd already kind of paid attention to it for a couple years prior because of Angola
Yeah.
and the South African Defense Force and things like that. But that was my first introduction to who the Afrikaans people were. Yes.
First question that comes into mind, obviously, those were the time of the Soweto uprising, 74, 76, etc., etc. Things are beginning to heat up in South Africa. What was your understanding of the system of apartheid? How did you understand apartheid? Mhm.
When I read the book, I learned an awful lot about Afrikaners as a people and about the Huguenots and the Dutch and the Germans who came there, the
My
Khoi and the
history.
San. Yeah, there you go. So I learned an awful lot about it from historical fiction. People shouldn't discount historical fiction. If it's done properly, it can be very informative.
Yeah.
And it sparked a lifelong interest from there. And so from there, I left high school in 82, went to university with a plan to study history, which is what I did at Ohio University. But I was 17 when I arrived at university and not really mature enough for university and escaping a very unpleasant childhood and just happy to have my independence and freedom. And also didn't have much money because I was a full student ride of grants and a loan, and then I worked part time just to get through school because I was poor. But I didn't apply myself very well. So by the spring, I said I'm wasting my time and other people's money. I need to come back to school when I'm ready. So I tried to enlist in the Army to get money to go to university and maybe learn something in the Army, grow up a little bit, and also get some experience in uniform. Because my ultimate goal is to become an Army officer. That's what I want to do. I want to lead
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
And that was a quick path to do it, I thought. So I went to university in the fall of 1982. Didn't really study anything in Africa because that's freshman introductory. So you're learning Western civilization courses, things like that, plus your basic math and English and all that, all those things. But I was introduced to the game of rugby shortly after arriving campus. We had a club team, a couple of them, and one of the upperclassmen told me on a Friday, this black guy said, "Hey, you come into the game tonight?" And I said, "The game's tomorrow." American football. He said, no, not football. Rugby, man. It's fun. So I went to the game. There were no stands. We just stood in touch. Didn't know any of the rules. And this is right after ESPN had started broadcasting Australian rules football in the early 1980s, introducing Americans to that. And I'm like, well, it's not Australian rules football. It's not soccer, thank goodness. And it's not American football. So it's fascinating. So one team beat the other team like 61-0, something like that. But after it's over, everybody came on the sidelines and touched and drank beer and hung out. And I'm like, what a cool game. Everybody gets along. So I was hooked on rugby in 1982. But of course, there's no professional rugby. There's no television of rugby. And we don't have the scene that South Africa and other countries have. So although we're the second largest rugby nation in the world as per rugby players registered behind the UK. But we just didn't have that sort of environment. So I decided I wanted to support a national team. Well, I looked and the United States didn't have a national team in 1982. Even though we were the defending Olympic champions from 1920 and 24, they just put a bunch of college kids together and went over to France and whipped the Europeans.
Yeah.
So So I looked in England. No, not going to support England. France, not going to happen. New Zealand, no. Australia, I don't think so. Maybe Scotland or Ireland. Well, South Africa. This South Africa thing's interesting. I read that book about the covenant. I'm interested in South Africa. Let me look at their history. Ooh, storied history. I'm a Springbok fan. And in 1982,
Okay.
I became a Springbok fan. Shortly after that, a Western Province fan, and have been
Yeah.
stuck to them like glue ever since.
Yeah. Well, they two important seeds that are planted there. The Covenant one, my history that you're talking about. Obviously, if you know my history, then I think it's natural that there will be some kind of an understanding, the forming of a bond between us. And when you add the Springboks to it, well, I think you begin to seal the deal. I want to go back though to the question of South Africa and how South Africa was viewed during the 70s and say the early 80s, mid 80s. What were what were the American view of South Africa from your perspective, and what was your view of what apartheid South Africa was all
I
about?
didn't have much of a focus on the politics of South Africa, and my interest was only tertiary because of Angola initially. And then
Yeah.
when I read the book, so that was the 77, 78, 79 timeframe. And then when I read the Covenant around 1980, sometime around then, and I was in high school by then. Then it became much more interesting for me. But I mean, it wasn't something that I paid a lot of attention to the politics. All I heard is that, there are a bunch of racists around the country. That's basically what they would say about it. There
Mhm.
was no focus on the history or why that system developed, right or wrong. It wasn't until the mid 80s that this became much more of a focus for me, talking about apartheid. And by then, the Western media had glommed on and linked on and tried to praise Winnie Mandela as a great hero, not the person who kidnapped kids and had them murdered.
Yeah.
But they
Okay.
praised Winnie Mandela. She was the face of the anti-apartheid movement, not Nelson Mandela. Most people in the West didn't even know who the heck Nelson Mandela was. He'd been in jail since '62, the Ravonia trials, and
Mhm.
so they only knew about him because she promoted him. But Winnie Mandela was the face of it, and so she was sympathetic to a lot of people, and it was in the press. I remember going to Amsterdam. I actually participated in anti-apartheid march. Not intentionally initially, but I went to Amsterdam on a trip in 1985, and we're walking down the street. We walked right into an anti-apartheid march. So we marched along with it for a little bit, and everything was in Dutch, about Moord and all this other stuff. And later, I looked into a little bit more, but didn't have an opinion really of the apartheid state and the policy until the mid 80s and the late 80s is when I really began to develop. And that's when I paid a lot more attention. I left the Army in 87, went back to university in 1987 to fix my grades, which were abysmal, and earn my degree and become an officer in the Army. And a little over 2 years later, I was back in the Army. And during that time frame, of course, Namibia gained its independence around that time frame. They began dismantling apartheid. It was a very consequential time, and there was a lot of pressure on South Africa with the sanctions and many other things. So that's when I paid a lot more attention from the mid 80s onwards, and that's really when. And actually, I should digress a little bit here. In 1984, I went to the Education Center in Bad Kreuznach at Rose Barracks to sign up for a college class in the evenings and weekends. And I saw this little pamphlet. This isn't it. I'm just using a prop. Saw this little pamphlet sitting there, and it said the Army Foreign Area Officer Program. Now, I was a private first class at the time. And this program is only for senior officers or field grade officers. So it said they send you to graduate school, the Army pays for it. Like, that's nice. Then they send you to language school and the Army pays for it. That's even better. Then
Mhm.
they send you for basically an internship where you typically work in an embassy under an attaché or a security assistance officer for a year, learning about your region. I said, that's cool. And then the rest of your career, you're supposed to work in that region. And I said, right then and there, 1984, I said, I want to go back to the Army. I want to go back to college, graduate, then I want to become a military intelligence officer, regular Army military intelligence officer, and then I want to, when I'm able, become a foreign area officer, sub-Saharan Africa, make full colonel, and be the defense attaché in South Africa. And all those things that I planned in
You
1984,
actually
actually
planned that as you just said it now
in
for
1984, true
yourself.
true story. I planned
Yeah.
all that in 1984. All of that came true, except the attaché in South Africa, because as I pinned on full colonel, the Africa Command gave that position from the Army to the U.S. Navy, and they retained it to this day. So it wasn't possible. But all the rest of it came true. And along the way, I learned 5 languages, became a published author, lectured undergraduates, lectured postgraduates as a professor, and then published in academia, also published in popular press. And yeah, so it's been a
Yeah.
fascinating ride.
Obviously, an incredible career. You became a military intelligence officer. I have a Hollywood understanding of that. Tell me just what is it that you do? I have an idea, but as I said, really based on Hollywood now, and connected to Africa, because obviously your career most of your career, as I understand it, was actually based in Africa.
Well, the second half of my career, at least, I spent 36 and a half years in the Army, 34 in active duty, which is incredibly unusual. I mean, when I retired, there couldn't have been more than 18 officers senior to me, and almost every one of them was a four-star general or a three-star general
Yeah.
because they've been in as long as me. But the reason I was able to stay there so long is I'd been enlisted. That doesn't count against your time. And then I stayed a full 30 years as a commissioned officer.
Yeah.
So the um, the intelligence thing. So first, I have to understand that it's not Jason Bourne. It's not James Bond. That's what people think. And I knew that going in because I'd been in the Army and I knew what an intelligence officer did. So I didn't think I was going to be James Bond. But a lot of my peers thought they're going to be James Bond when they came into the intelligence training. But what it is you're the officer that's responsible for gathering combat information, turning into actual intelligence, which is intelligence comes after analysis. Otherwise, it's just information. So that the commander is informed about where the enemy is going to be or what the threats from the weather or the environment are or health issues, so that you reduce the number of casualties and you keep conflict as less damaging as possible. I guess that's
Yeah.
the best way to phrase it.
Yeah.
So there are lots of different intelligence officers. Everyone who goes to the intelligence course as an officer is initially a tactical intelligence officer, which means that you're focused on the battalion, the brigade, and the division level of operations. And then later, some officers move on to specialists like signals intelligence officer for communications and radars and things like that. Others become counterintelligence officers and agents, and others become strategic intelligence officers. I was all of those. I was a tactical intelligence officer, later became a counterintelligence officer and ran human intelligence operations in the Balkans, and also had to investigate Americans accused of espionage and do security background investigations and things like that. And then I,
Let me interrupt you here again, just to get me a picture in my head again. What do I see in front of me? Are you a guy in a bunker with headphones on and listening into telephone calls, or how does it work in practice? Just give me an
So,
idea.
okay, well, that's a fair question. So, I'll give an example of the first Gulf War. I was an assistant battalion S2, so an intelligence officer in a battalion, and we fought against the Republican Guard and several other divisions in the first Gulf War, which
Yeah,
fortunately
yeah,
didn't last very long.
yeah.
So, I'm riding around in combat once we crossed the line of departure in combat inside an armored vehicle with 7 radios in the back, wearing flame retardant tanker suit so I don't burn up if we get hit with a round. And then on top of that, a chemical protection suit and a stupid mask because we were worried they're going to use chemical weapons. Listening to 7 different radio networks simultaneously, grasping information and then analyzing it on the fly and delivering it to the commanders over different networks. And that's what a tactical intelligence officer does.
So
Sometimes
in
you're on
other
the
words, the Hollywood picture is not all that wrong. The Jason Bourne thing is not all that wrong.
Well, Jason Bourne was kind of different, but yeah. So that's a tactical intelligence officer. But then as a counterintelligence officer, there are different ways, some which I can't discuss what you do, and that kind of goes into the Jason Bourne world. So I'll leave that off the table because
Mhm.
sources and methods have to be protected. But much what you do as a counterintelligence officer, you're trying to determine what the threats are to your forces or to your mission. So you're determining what any hostile intelligence service is trying to do, and you're trying to counter that. So what you do there, that's why you do investigations of people accused of espionage, because you're trying to stop the espionage. And then you also talk to people on the ground. And in that case, sometimes you're wearing civilian clothes. Sometimes you have relaxed grooming standards, longer hair and a beard and things like that. Sometimes you're clean shaven, you're wearing uniforms. And so that's what counterintelligence. And by the way, that's a federal law enforcement official position. So I was a federal law enforcement official with badge and credentials with legal authority to arrest people and detain them and things like that. So, and interrogate people. So that's what that is. Then the signals intelligence officer can be a tactical position, and it can also be, for instance, I worked at the National Security Agency, and that's where I had that skill. And you get these skills by attending a course and then doing actual follow-on assignment, which I did at the National Security Agency. But at the National Security Agency, I wound up being the chief of staff of a $3 billion acquisition program, so 60 billion rand, to modernize a way that we collected information and analyzed it. And then the strategic intelligence officer, you wind up dealing with higher level things like the national level intelligence requirements. I've worked at Defense Intelligence Agency where I had the good fortune of writing for the President of the United States. Up until 9/11, the only agency that gave intelligence to the president was actually the Central Intelligence Agency. And that started in 1965 or 64 with something called the Presidential Daily Brief under President Lyndon Johnson. And that product was from 60s until about 2004, an exclusive domain of the CIA. But of course, the CIA didn't predict 9/11. They didn't predict a whole lot of things. And so one of the results of the commission was that, hey, more of the intelligence agencies should be writing for the president. And so the Defense Intelligence Agency was eager to write for the president. So they encouraged analysts to write things. And so you come up with a proposal about something that's going to happen in the future that could affect U.S. strategically. And so I did that. And when I was there, I wrote 9 of these, which would make me a rock star if I worked at the CIA. If you get published once for the president, yeah, everyone knows, hey, Chris has got published by the president, and that
Yeah.
kind of you're probably going to get promoted. At CIA, or not, at DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, I could walk back there today, and I probably couldn't get in the building, get a cup of coffee because nobody cares about the 9 that I wrote. But I wrote them, and they were focused, of course, on Africa and Southern Africa in particular. So, yeah, it was pretty a very rewarding experience to have done this. I did things that saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and that's no
Yeah.
embellishment, no kidding. So it's pretty cool. So when I get to the pearly gates and St. Peter says, "What have you done?" I'm like, "Hey, did you read what I wrote for the president? Okay, you can pass."
When did South Africa become more a focus for you than the rest of your activities in the rest of the world?
Well, South Africa became more of a focus for me in the late 80s, a personal focus. And I
Mm.
focused on that long before I ever got into the field that I hoped to get into
Yeah.
based on that life career plan that I put together in 1984. But my career in Africa, so I'm a graduate of l'École d'État-Major, which is the Tunisian Staff College.
Mm.
Now we have staff college of our own in America, so I was a graduate of that. But what they like to do when they send you to work as basically an intern is if they can get you into a foreign military academy or school, they like you to do that, especially if it's in a foreign language like Portuguese or French or something like that for Africa. So I went to the L'École d'État-Major in Tunis, and then I worked in the attaché office there. So I was stationed in Tunisia, in Liberia, where I rebuilt the armed forces of Liberia. I had a team of about 750 people that worked for me, a $234 million program, something like that. So Tunisia, Liberia, Botswana, Malawi, Niger, Mauritania, Uganda, and Ethiopia are all countries I've lived in and worked. All of them through the embassy. I was working there, but I did all sorts of different activities, working with non-government organizations, commercial companies, hunting terrorists, building peacekeeping capability, doing peacekeeping, running HIV clinics, establishing programs, Ebola research programs, all sorts of things, building schools and clinics. And I've also lectured at the G5 Sahel Defense College. I was the first foreign lecturer to ever do that. I don't even know if they're still open because the G5's kind of fallen apart. Also at the Nigerian War College, I also lectured there. And so I travel all over Africa. That's the countries I lived in. I've worked in probably 38 to 42 of the African countries at one point or another.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk about South Africa and South Africa today. I want to just try to build a bridge between the young man that read The Covenant, discovered rugby in South Africa, and the Colonel Chris Wyatt that we see today on the screen that have become, whether that's what you intended to do or not, but become a de facto kind of a voice for many in South Africa. At least there are many in South Africa that feel that way, that you become kind of a voice for at least the USA, I would imagine, representing the Afrikaner minority in the country.
Well, from the very outset, from the birth of South Africa, from its new dispensation, 1994, I was all in and spent much of my time not busy enjoying life or doing my job, paying attention to South Africa. But not just South Africa, all of Southern Africa.
Yeah, yeah. What were your impressions of the transition, the building of the new democracy in South Africa, the hope that we had for South Africa? Let me paint it this way: when South Africa became a democracy, I was a foreign correspondent here in Europe, and I had the opportunity of viewing the events in South Africa from Europe. And I remember us sitting off the balloons, great happiness. Finally, South Africa is free. Finally, liberation has arrived. How did you view all of that?
Well, I mean, like much of the world, I fell for a lot of the storyline that was being pushed and rubbished a lot of the warts under the carpet. Of course, I watched the AWB and what happened in Bophuthatswana with the murder of those guys. But if,
Yeah,
I'm not saying they had it coming, but that's not how you deal with that. But no, I remember the fear that the right wing was going to overthrow and lead a civil war. When actually, what was happening is that there was the left wing having a civil war in KZN, as ANC operatives were murdering 20,000 IFP leaders. And I actually paid attention to that. That started in the late 80s and it continued this time frame. And so, a lot of people in the West, especially Europe and even the United States, time stopped on April 27th, 1994. Seeing the queues of Tunnies and Gogos standing out there in line for 12 hours, 87 years old, never got to vote in their entire life, getting to vote for the first time. Oh, kumbaya, it's all wonderful. And that's where history stopped for South Africa for most people in the West, but not for me. I paid attention. And as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up, I began to become distressed about what was happening in South Africa. Because in my view, despite the fact that Desmond Tutu was involved with it, who's an honorable man, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just a whitewash. and it was used to excuse horrific murders by black activists while trying to just not give amnesty to whites who committed crimes. And that already set a bad tone for me. And I paid attention. Antje Krog wrote a book, Not in My Skull or something like that, about her experiences following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after it had ended. And so that really is where I started to say something isn't right here. And this reconciliation is not genuine in some respects. Now, we see today that for many people, it's not genuine at all, and that's sad. But the good news is it's a small percentage of South Africans that behave this way. The bad news is they have an outsized influence.
When, in your view, do you think that the ideals of the rainbow nations started to falter, to change? When we were all very idealistic. I had the opportunity to have met Nelson Mandela, I met Thabo Mbeki, I met Jacob Zuma, I met much of the ANC leadership, and I have to admit today, looking back at it, I was really under a kind of a spell of these people, and much of the work that I did was influenced by the magic of these people at the time and the promise of this incredibly wonderful ideal of the multicultural, multiracial rainbow nation. When, in your view, when did it start going wrong in South Africa?
Well, I saw warning signs, as I said, in the late 1990s already with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I mean, that's not enough to say that it went wrong. Also, I saw very disturbing signs with Thabo Mbeki, who has a very fragile ego, and took the advice that some of us offered about the potential for a disaster with HIV before it became a disaster because of long distance trucking routes, because of men living in hostels, sleeping with prostitutes and having multiple concurrent partnerships, which wasn't a term that was used then, but, sleeping around is what we said. Thabo Mbeki's fragile ego took that as an assault and attack on black men or sexuality, which it wasn't. But the mere fact that someone white would suggest it meant he dug his heels in. And he and Minister Beetroot and their nonsense that or AIDS is caused not by HIV, but caused by, poverty is ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. And so that was a disturbing sign for me, too, as I watched hundreds of thousands of South African children born unnecessarily with HIV because the U.S. government offered nevirapine, which reduced mother-to-child transmission at the time by 50%. Now it's by 90+%. But hundreds of thousands of South Africans needlessly born with HIV because of the arrogance and the asshattery of Thabo Mbeki. And that's when I began to really question things. But when the Polokwane massacre took place, as I call it, that's when Thabo Mbeki was unseated by Jacob Zuma at the party conference, then I really sat up and paid attention to where this is going to go. And it wasn't too long after that that things looked a little bit fishy. But for the whole time, we had this discussion of the arms deal. At this time already, what had happened there? And it's all being pushed under the carpet. And I always had questions about the arms deal. I thought that was the dumbest thing since a box of rocks. If you want to have an army to do what Nelson Mandela wanted to do, interfere in peacekeeping around the continent, because that's what South Africa does. They interfere. They don't make any place any better. I'm sorry. That's just the reality. So if you want that army to do that, then you need to fund the army. Not the Navy. You don't need corvettes and frigates. You don't need Gripen jets, fighter jets. Not a single country around South Africa could threaten South Africa. You don't need Type 209 diesel submarines. That's ludicrous. Why do you have those things unless it's to grift money? And eventually that's what we found out. And I actually asked these questions when those contracts were awarded. I said, why are we doing this? You need to spend money buying new trucks and new armored personnel carriers and pay soldiers a living wage and train them. That's where the money needs to go, not into these big white elephant projects. And so for me, it all started to go bad in the late 1990s and became obvious by the time that Zuma came in office. And by 2011, 2012, even people who had their eyes shut should have been seeing what's happening here. And that's where I've been ever since. Now, I was very kind to the ANC for a long time because I believe the ANC has always had at least two, possibly three factions. The so-called radical economic transformation faction, which hates white people and wants revenge and believes in nationalization and communism and other stupid stuff like that. And then you also had legitimate people in the ANC who actually cared about a multiracial, market-based economy, a multiracial society. And for a long time, they held this way. Certainly when Thabo Mbeki was there, I think they held this way, the technocrats. But that's no longer the case. And these days, I blame the ANC. As late as 2018, when I spoke at the Great Decisions Brief, part of the Ivy League lecture series, the Army War College does that as well, they said South Africa's fragile democracy. And I gave a lecture, which is available online, where I talked about this for 2 hours. And I said that in many ways, South Africa has a lot of strengths. They have an independent media. The ANC has some good people. And now Cyril Ramaphosa is coming in as the president after being deputy president, he has a narrow window to prove that the ANC really wants to make change and improve the country. But of course, that's not what happened. In fact, things have been far worse in many respects under Ramaphosa than they ever were under Zuma. And that's a shocking statement to make.
Do you still today fundamentally believe the ideals of the existence of the unitary South Africa?
Well, especially
I've put it in very clumsy terms now, but I think you kind of get what I'm trying to get at. A lot of people are saying to me, and in fact, I read the comment today again, the problem with South Africa is that you are trying to marry too many groups that are so vastly different from one another. And if you go back to the days of the National Party and towards the end of the National Party, there were also other African leaders like Mangosuthu Buthelezi, like Lucas Mangope, etc., who would have favored the idea of splitting up the country in different provinces, creating a different kind of a federal system in the country, or whatever the case might be. So what I'm trying to get is, where is your heart today? Are you for this multicultural democracy in South Africa, or do you believe it will not work?
Well, I think your question isn't unfair, but it's unfair of me to say where my heart is for South Africa because I'm not a South African. But I would say that yeah, Lucas Mangope definitely would like that break apart. I mean, he's still beloved by many Tswana today, and even Botswana. In Botswana, they love Lucas Mangope and his memory about what he did with Maputo Tswana. But what a crazy so-called country with borders where you drive a kilometer, you're back in South Africa, you drive another kilometer, you're back in Maputo Tswana. It's ludicrous. Of course, a friend of mine, Bantu Holomisa, was down in his own homeland there, where he led that homeland for a while. So yeah, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi. My one regret here, I have to tell you, Johan, is that in 2022, I was invited to the opening of the center in honor of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and they invited me after my trip was already set, and I couldn't change it just before I was supposed to get down there, and I had a VIP seat, like 3 seats away from Buthelezi. That would have been incredible. I never got a chance to interview him. I think he's a fascinating figure in history. But as far as the homelands, I mean, look, I don't buy the argument that South Africans can't live together in a unitary state. I think it's nonsense. But today, it's becoming increasingly difficult because of the government's positions and the hypocrisy of things. I mean, this nonsense of dual standards. So, for instance, let me just pick a couple social things out of the air here. This situation with Ronaldo Gous in Port Elizabeth, where he made a video to make a point 15 years ago in which he didn't insult anybody by name, simply used the N word and the K word, used to destroy his political career. But then a music producer can run around Notabule and call white people Neanderthals and canines and say they should be put on leashes and white women are genetically inferior. When he suffers no consequences that, and Ronaldo Gous is nearly bankrupted paying legal fees because the South African Human Rights Commission hunts him down and doesn't have, equality before the law. This is the problem. And the nonsense that's going on in South Africa now that's being fostered, perpetrated, and permitted by the government of South Africa and by the courts of South Africa is what's making it impossible for a unitary state. A lot of people have been talking for 5 years. I've interviewed all the key players in Cape Independence from all the groups repeatedly and visited them many times, one in South Africa, not because I'm in favor of it, but because it's newsworthy. Or I'm not opposed to it either. I'm agnostic. But if the Western Cape became an independent country, I would visit it, guarantee it. If it stays in South Africa, I'll visit it. But to me, Zulu autonomy may come before that. I mean, the Zulu are not exactly thrilled. That's one reason why, Jacob Zuma can get all the support for his crazy, ridiculous, non-existent MK party. So I would disagree that South Africa can't be a unitary state. But the way things are currently right now, it isn't going to be possible because the racial hatred, the class hatred that's whipped up by politicians, and the nonsense that politicians get away with, calling for the murder of people, and it's protected. But the Union flag, which was a symbol of reconciliation between the Boer and the Afrikaner in 1910, after the Union of South Africa Act, this flag was created after that to represent a union of these republics and colonies. How is that a symbol of hate? And that can get you put in prison, but you can call for murdering people and nothing happens, or say that white women are genetically inferior and that doesn't hurt people's feelings. So the rhetoric, the environment that's being allowed to be fostered in South Africa, which is very much racial and very much classist, is what's making it impossible for a unitary state. But I think South Africans live. Look, Johan, I've been everywhere in South Africa except in Mpumalanga. I haven't really been to Mpumalanga, but I've been all over South Africa many, many, many times. I have. So you're talking about Afrikaner's affinity for me, but I have a lot of colored viewers. I have a lot of Indian viewers, and there's a number of Black South Africans who watch my content and who come to my meet and greets. Although not this last time, people are terrified now being identified and going to one of my meet and greets because the false narrative that I'm a white supremacist and racist. So they're just terrified. But lots of South African friends. I promote Afrikaans, Tswana, and Sotho cultures and language all the time because it's an amazing place. I think that these people can live together. My experiences I have, especially the Tswana and the Afrikaners, they get along very well. Coloreds and white South Africans, most times I've been around, they get along. People can live on their own, develop on their own, like Oranje or the Inganyama Trust. But people can also get together. And I think the natural progression is for barriers to break down. And we saw this in the first years after apartheid ended, people getting together and associating freely. But when you force people apart or force them together, that creates a problem. And that's what's been happening in the past 15 years in South Africa. And I think it's reprehensible.
Aaron's roots, I'm sure you know, you've probably met Aaron's as well. He's just set up his organization. There are a lot of voices, and I would imagine we would be fair to describe them as conservative Afrikaner voices, calling for a space of their own. My language runs the risk of being destroyed in the future because of the Bella laws in South Africa. BEE is a major factor that plays into all of this. The question in my mind, looking at it from here, from a distance, is whether we put our trust into building this multicultural democracy, or whether we put our trust and our hopes in following people like an Aaron's Roots or other groups that are saying, no, we're going to have to find some ways of either whether we call it devolution of power, local governments, canton systems, all sorts of things have been put on the table as alternatives. Where do you think? What are you say that you are a friend not only of the Afrikaner but of all of South Africa's people. Where what do you think we should invest our time and energy in? Building this multicultural democracy, or beginning to think of ways in which we can find spaces for different nations, different groups in South Africa to cooperate, whether it is in a federal system or a canton system or whatever the kind of ideals might be of people such as Aaron's Roots?
Well, I think the first step is to get rid of the African National Congress. Remove them at the ballot box. I mean, that's what has to be done. It's an arrogant party full of people who are very rude and disrespectful of others' thoughts and concerns. And that's part of the problem. And they're very cynical in almost everything they do. Those who had good intention in the party have been silent for too long, and therefore I no longer trust them any longer. So that's the first step. But as far as, a lot of folks, you've got AfriForum talking about self-bestuur, the self-reliance. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. And there's nothing wrong with Xhosa or with Venda or with Tswana or Khoi having the same sort of thing. But until this cancerous behavior of a predatory state is removed, I mean, it's just going worse and worse. So look at what's happened this year. The Bella Act has been approved, and that takes power away from local school boards. And while Afrikaners feel aggrieved, what bothers me about the whole thing is that I don't understand why Black South Africans aren't up in arms. People love to use this stupid language of colonialism, colonial languages. Isn't English a colonial language? Now you're going to force all 5- and 6-year-olds going to primary school who don't speak English, only 6% of South Africans speak it as a first language, to learn in English the day they arrive at school. Talk about putting kids back and pushing them behind their peers in the rest of Africa. That's just stupid. Nothing wrong with learning English as a second language. That's my first language. And it was colonially imposed here. No problem with that. And it's a skill you should have in the world if you want to go out in the world. But the reality is kids should be able to be taught in their first language, and because that's what they're fluent in when they arrive at school. So Bella. Then we've got this idiotic black tax, this little corrupt, slush fund of R1 billion or whatever, 80 billion rand they want to put together by taking 3% of the profit from corporations and putting it in and giving money exclusively to Black entrepreneurs. Not only is that racist, it's counterproductive. And it's going to destroy several businesses that are profitable, because a lot of businesses, particularly in the grocery industry, operate on small margins of 3 to 5%. So you're going to destroy them. So then you've got that. Then you've got the expropriation without compensation, which, as I've told people all along, it's in the Constitution, but you must compensate people. And it's not about land. This is a red herring. Land is part of it, but land is the cudgel being used to undermine the safety and security of South Africa and push this towards this communist model. It's not about land. It's about property. If you read Section 25, it clearly states that property is not exclusively land. So your stocks, your bonds, your medical aid, your pension funds, your bucky, your jewelry, your apartment, your house can all be taken in the interest of the state. The trial is to see how far they can go with expropriation on compensation that's now passed. So we've got a situation in which things are getting progressively worse by the day. By the day. Cyril Ramaphosa is doubling down. And the man lies to the President of the United States. He goes to the Oval Office and sits there and lectures President Trump. And then the media lie about it and say Trump was the guy who was rude. No, Cyril Ramaphosa interrupted his host in the Oval Office, talk about cheek, and took the question and then lied. And then when he's asked a question about Julius Malema singing Kill the Boar, he said, oh, I disavow this. Yet we have video in 2018 after Julius has been singing this for years of Ramaphosa saying, oh, his natural home is the ANC. We welcome the EFF back in the ANC. And then we have him coming back to South Africa saying that, no, it's free speech. He can do what he wants. But I thought you repudiated it. That doesn't mean you have to arrest him, but you can, but he doesn't disavow it because the EFF and Julius Malema are useful idiots. They are the foot soldiers of the ANC in the absence of Umkhonto we Sizwe because there is no Umkhonto we Sizwe in the ANC anymore. So they do the stupid things that the ANC politicians, many of them like to do. In the current environment, it's not possible to have a unitary state. And when you talk about groups that want to go their own way and do their own thing, I understand that and appreciate that. People lose their minds over Rania. I don't know why. It's a company town. You have to abide by the rules. I live in a homeowners association. I'm a beekeeper. I can't put beehives on my property. That sucks. But I can't afford to buy land. It's too expensive here. So I can't do it. That's the rules. If, and people want to go on about Irania, oh, it's racist. No, it's not. I'm not an Afrikaner. I'm not a Dutch Calvinist. I don't speak Afrikaans fluently. I can read it and understand it, but I can't move to Irania. I'm not one of those people. That's the rules. I can't buy land in the Ngunyama Trust because it's all held in trust by the president or by the king, excuse me. So people are just losing their minds over nothing. I think that it's okay for people to want to develop on their own. When I go to the Free State and I go through the Golden Gate Park, there's a Basuto cultural village. There shouldn't be Afrikaners living there. It's a Basuto cultural village. There shouldn't be English living there. There shouldn't be Zulu living there. It's a Basuto cultural village. They're allowed to live on their own and develop on their own. But that doesn't mean they can't live in a unitary state. Switzerland has this model. Belgium, less successful. But there are examples, even in Africa, in Botswana, which is largely considered to be homogenous. It's not. It's about 85% Tswana speakers, or Setswana, as we say there. But there's also the Kalanga who fled into there from Zimbabwe. You've got 50,000 Bushmen. You've got the Herero in the Northwest. Everybody forgets about these people. And then 8% of the population is white, higher than in South Africa. People forget about that. And Botswana, people get along just fine, except for the abuse of the Bushmen. But that's a whole other story.
How much of the African National Congress's actions today do you think is driven by the ideals of the National Democratic Revolution? And how alive is the National Democratic Revolution, do you think, in current South African ANC politics?
Well, I mean, if you talk to Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, she's got some great views on this. Probably one of the best authorities on this subject, if to my mind. And I think that she would I can't want to speak for her, but I think she would probably say that there's still be an element of that in the ANC's ideology. But I think that from my perspective, to be quite honest, most of the people in the ANC that have power use that as an excuse to accumulate wealth and direct tender contracts their way and for self-aggrandizement, self-enrichment. I don't think there's a whole lot of true believers in the NDR. They use it as a tool, an excuse to hoodwink followers, to garner votes, to get away with the nonsense they do. There are, don't get me wrong, there are people who really believe in that nonsense. The NDR is nonsense. And it's not the path that South Africa should be on. But I don't think it's a strong percentage. Just like I'm also concerned that those that believe in a multiracial, capital-based society are also diminishing and falling by the wayside. The people that are rising in ascendancy in the ANC are either crooks or the radical economic transformation. And I think that Ramaphosa is in a very precarious position. He barely became the president of the party and then the president of the Republic as a consequence of that back in late 2017 and then became president in 2018. And if you look at his first cabinet, it's very clear. It's full of Zuma stalwarts. He didn't shake and rock the boat much. And I think that he finds himself in a very difficult spot right now. Ramaphosa needs a Democratic alliance. And the Democratic alliance doesn't realize how much power they have because they really could influence things, but they have no influence, which proves to me that this whole current situation is just about people's self-enrichment, self-aggrandizement.
Question, though, is we have the Ballot law has been passed, signed by Ramaphosa. Expropriation it's become a fact. The law is becoming a fact. It's challenged right now in a court, but it's becoming a fact. BEE is a fact. All of these things are eating away at the fabric of one part of society. And whether the profits of all of that is going to the right people or to a small elite becomes irrelevant. It's a fact that these things are happening. And we don't seem to be able to stop that, which takes me, I think, to Ramaphosa's visit to the White House. Um, Insofar as I'm concerned, if you look at the optics, you're right. I think that I sat here in my house and I said to a friend of mine, my goodness, Trump is smashing Ramaphosa here like you cannot believe. But at the end of the day, nothing changed. Ramaphosa came back from the White House and affirmed that BEE will be the policy of the future.
And this is what baffles me by those who are opposed to black economic empowerment. I say, what do you want to see happening? Do you want to see black people continuing to play the role of laborers, drawers of water, hewers of wood, and consumers only? Why can't black people be made to own productive aspects of life? Why can't they be rich as well? That is what needs to happen. Because it is when they get to that level. Dr. Mulder, you look at the Afrikaners, the history of your people. If you look at the history of your people, they were held back by the English. And with later days, they were enabled. They became more and more economically empowered. And they became economically empowered due to the policies of apartheid, the laws that were put in place, the sweet deals that they were given, and they started getting more and more into being serious economic players. Why can't the same be done for black people?
So my question is just, it's a question I asked to somebody 2 or 3 days ago as well in one of my podcasts. It seems to me that this huge machine, and I call it then the democratic revolution, seems to be sort of eating away slowly, and it seems like an unstoppable machine. Am I right in my assessment of that? And that's why I have the questions about, should we not invest more of our time in people that want to bring us alternatives, like the Aaron's Roots of this world, people that are calling for a different kind of order in South Africa?
Well, South Africa does need a different kind of order. I've argued this all along. First, South Africa is not a genuine democracy. It's a farce. You don't even vote for politicians. You vote for a party list. What kind of nonsense, juvenile, Mickey Mouse primary school voting is that? You know, it's the parties who decide who represents you. And the perfect example of this was the ANC's cater deployment, sending Venda from Limpopo down to Cape Town, where they don't speak Afrikaans or Xhosa or English. And they're down there to represent the people down there. They don't know anything about the place. And their loyalty is entirely to the Thule House. It's corrupt. And it isn't just the ANC, it's every single party. And they all agreed to this at CODESA to come up with this stupid system. And then this nonsense of having parliamentary governments at municipal level, so that the government and Joburg and PE fall apart every 5 seconds and nothing gets accomplished. This is stupid. South Africa needs a complete overhaul in its so-called democracy. People need to be able to vote for the people that are running for office directly. And then if you don't like the bums, throw them out next time. That gives you some recourse to vote, right? You have no recourse. No recourse. People didn't want Winnie Mandela in parliament, but she was there because the ANC put her there. They put her high on the list. You know, that's ridiculous. And the voters should have had a say in whether Ronaldo Gos was removed from parliament, not the Democratic Alliance. He broke no parliamentary rules. I don't sound like I'm a fanboy for Ronaldo. I'm not. But he broke no parliamentary rules. He committed no crimes. He committed no offenses. He was kneecapped by cowardly politicians, and the voters they were undermined. Talk to the people of Port Elizabeth where he was a ward counselor. It'd be hard to find people that don't like what he did. I visited him there, and the guy worked 18 hours a day answering constituents' issues. You know, just because he was dedicated. And this is how he gets treated by a system. Look, this entire system is not democratic. It's a farce on every level. And it's not going to be fixed until you have a federal system. And that's not going to happen until the ANC's gone, because they're not going to allow for constitutional change. So what you're going to have, if what you're talking about is we listen to Aronson, we listen to others, and the Oranje model or the Kleinfontein model and all these other things, whether it's Afrikaners or it's Tswana or it's Sotho, people just want to live by themselves and they isolate themselves, society is going to collapse. But even short of that, whether that happens or not, it's going to collapse anyway. There's only so much that can be stolen. And when you said earlier, Johan, that it's affecting a segment of society, I would slightly disagree with that and say that it affects everybody. When you deny an Afrikaans-speaking kid who gets 98% in his matric entry into UCT because he's white, and you let someone in who has a 45% score because they're black, which happens, by the way, you undermine everyone. We did this stupidity in America with affirmative action, giving people entry into law school or into universities based on their skin color who weren't prepared. The answer was to better prepare them for university, not to elevate them when they're not prepared for it. And, we've got entire accounting firms that have to bring in retirees to do the accounting or to train the illiterate, functionally illiterate accountants who graduate from South Africa's universities and trade schools who are ill prepared because they're pushed through this nonsense. So society's on the verge of collapsing anyway in South Africa because of the nonsense that's going on here. And it doesn't really matter whether people come up with self-bestir and protect themselves and proof their communities. When the whole thing collapses and people are hungry and starving, the hordes are going to come. Whether those hordes or whatever their ethnicity, they're going to come. And there's only so much you can do. And if you want a test case, all we have to do is look at July 2021, KZN. Look what happened there. The police were ill prepared. I warned them on June 29th. Rehearse, train, bullets, rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons. Get them from Cape Town to Joburg down to KZN. None of that happened. Then the Army comes in. And the Army didn't even have rations. They went to the few stores still open that weren't burned down and jumped the queue to get food for people waiting 3 days to buy something at Pick and Pay or Checkers. We've had a dress rehearsal for this. I'm not predicting South Africa's going to collapse, but the way it is now can't continue because the people that are eating are doing exactly what Michaela Wrong said. Michaela Wrong, the Kenyan journalist who wrote the book, It's Our Turn to Eat. It's exactly what they're doing. They're rapacious. The difference between the National Party and the ANC and now the GNU government is that under the National Party, there was a favored patronage group, Afrikaners, and they were elevated and put in positions. But the difference between them and the ANC is that they were competent. By and large, those officers were competent, and corruption was minimal. There was corruption. There's always corruption. We can't deny that. But it was an unjust system, but at least it was functional. Now you have people put in positions for patronage who have no qualifications, no skills. We look at, in Northwest Province, 37% of the people who are teaching aren't even qualified to teach. Why are they teaching? Yeah. So I could go on for hours, but the thing is going to collapse because everyone's suffering, and there's only so much blood you can get from a stone. The 7% of the population or the 12% of the population that's paying all the taxes can't continue doing this. You can't continue to give handouts to people and build lifelong dependency and a culture of expectation and entitlement and expect that people aren't going to burn tires and burn houses down and attack people when they're hungry. That's what's going on.
I am trying to look towards the solutions or trying to find the answer. What are the solutions? Let me tell you two things, and to some of the viewers that might watch this, you've heard this before. On the night of the first democratic elections of South Africa, I sat in Amsterdam in my house having dinner with the African National Congress's representative in Amsterdam, in Holland. And he said to me exactly the words you use now, "Now it's our time to eat, my brother." Those were his words. Another story that I like to tell people is that I met Mbeki on several occasions as a South African journalist doing short little interviews with him. And I once stood at a conference in Montreux, outside the conference building. I had a cigarette with Thabo Mbeki, and I was talking about my future as a white man in South Africa. This was back in about 1996, I think, around about that time. I think Mbeki was then deputy president of South Africa. I might have the timeline a little bit wrong. And Mbeki told me that his words were that the process in South Africa will unfold in 3 stages. I never realized at the time what he was really telling me. Many, many years later, I revisited his words and I realized what he was talking about. He said the first phase of the revolution, as he called it, will be taking control of the institution, the mechanics, the mechanisms of the state, of the police, of the military. He said then there will be, following that, there will be a longish period. He called it 10 years, 15 years, what he called the cooling off period, the period in which the whites will get used to the new dispensation. And he said, and then the real revolution would start. Now, if you go back on his words then in something like 1996, it sort of reminds one of the words of Ramaphosa and the frog and the boiling water theory. But it is also a very precise definition of the National Democratic Revolution. Now, another thing that he said to me, And I've never been able to find the words. I cannot quote him verbatim, but I used to tell the story in Afrikaans to friends of mine, and I said, Mbeki told me, die ANC het 'n lang asem. The ANC has got to translate it from a long asem, a long breath, play the long game. It's a patient organization. Now, against what I just told you now, recent developments in South Africa, the fact of BEE, the fact of expropriation without compensation, the fact of the Bella law. It seems to me, and that's my fear, is that this thing is simply grinding away and grinding away. And it appears, if one takes a distant view, like something that is unstoppable. And then I go to the visit of Ramaphosa in the Oval Office, and what happened there, and the joy that a lot of us felt. I called it a kind of a sugar rush that we all got with the Afrikaner refugees, etc., etc. Behind that, the dark cloud of this machine that is just eating away and eating away. So that's my question at the end of the day. Is you're an analyst. What do you advise your president? What do you advise your friends? What do we need to do? What should we do to try to, Aaron's Roots talks about the ship is not only going the right direction, but the ship is also fast sinking. What do we do outside just naming these things that we talked about?
Well, I don't know that South Africans have much of an opportunity here. The Democratic Alliance foolishly seems to think that they can go to the courts and change things, but the courts have been reliable and been captured depending on the issue. Remember that the Tourism Relief Fund was declared constitutional despite the fact that it was racist and a clear violation of the Constitution. Only when it went up to the Constitutional Court was it overturned, but by then all the money allocated to it was gone, and they accomplished what they wanted. So the pretext of a legitimate government is what the ANC is using here and using the law, using it immorally. And the only way I see something changes is if an outside actor takes concrete action that can actually get the attention of these elites and force them to change. Okay. And the time is now. There's only one leader in the world.
Sorry, Chris, to interrupt you. And I would suggest that was the moment that we saw happening, or at least is part of this. What we saw in the Oval Office happening between Trump and Ramaphosa.
Well, there's a couple things that happen. I think a lot of people assume that coming out of that there'd be sanctions applied to South African leaders and travel bans and restrictions. Other people, said nothing's happened. Well, the refugee program has been accelerated. And despite the fact the media is not covering that story, they don't have the information because they're untrusted. They're too dishonest. They're doxing people and harming them. So the refugee program has been accelerated and more people are being approved and already coming over to America without people even realizing it. And that is going to bleed South Africa dry of a tax base and of a human capital base. You've already got a couple million South Africans minimum living abroad who have the best skills that South Africa needs. I just had a conversation with the former information minister and former war veterans leader from Zimbabwe. I interviewed him just the other day, Chris Mutsvanga, because Zimbabwe is desperate to get human capital back. And I said, well, I can go to Canary Wharf. I can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Zimbabwean banker or financier who's making a fortune. They should be in Harare. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with South Africans. They shouldn't be in New York. They shouldn't be in Auckland. They shouldn't be in Sydney. They should be in Joburg and Pretoria. But I think that that it's going to take an external actor. So I'm not saying the United States is going to do anything, but let's just put this on the table. Let's say if the United States under Trump did something. And I think that Trump is preparing to do something. And I think at a minimum, it's going to include sanctions against some ANC officials and against government. So 1985 and 2025 are very different. In 1985, there was no SWIFT banking system. You couldn't shut people out of their national flow of finance. You could, but it wasn't as efficient or instantaneous like it is now. Just ask the Russians; they were shut out overnight. Yeah. But they were smart. They went to the Chinese before they launched their war, and Chinese agreed to buy a bunch of their commodities and pay in hard currency. So they still got the money. But anyway, so South Africa could be cut out of SWIFT banking system like that. South Africa is already not getting any endorsement from the United States, for the IMF, IMF and World Bank. We've already cut $500 million, 10 billion rand in assistance, which, despite the bravado from South African politicians like Wade and Mantashe, if they don't give us the aid, we won't give them minerals. Hey, buddy, we buy the minerals. You want to cut your nose off to spite your face? And the U.S. trade with South Africa could be embargoed. That's 4%, 5% of your GDP overnight. That could cause an economic collapse in South Africa overnight. You already have 141,000 jobs at risk from your auto industry, which can no longer ship tax-advantaged, duty-advantaged trucks and BMWs to the United States. Now, because the South African government hasn't bothered to send a trade representative, and because this meeting went so poorly, you still have everybody here negotiating the tariffs down. So after 90 days, it's 31% on South Africa. That's $20 billion a year in two-way trade. That's the second largest trading partner, and it's your most beneficial trading partner. China buys coal. China buys iron from South Africa. China buys platinum, and they ship their finished industrial goods and cheap consumer goods to South Africa. Yeah. But the U.S. buys BMWs. The whole beneficiation of that value chain is produced in South Africa and employs hundreds of thousands of people for parts, for shipping, for material, for raw materials, for construction, and they get shipped to the U.S. And we buy your agriculture goods, which are higher value too. So the loss of that could be devastating. And Trump could embargo South Africa tomorrow. He's already cut the aid off. That's had a devastating impact. The bravado that we don't need the aid. Well, guess what? Suddenly, South African universities are screaming for $4 billion in money to continue research in the medical field. UCT, Rhodes, they don't have any money because it all came from USAID. The Americans were paying for this. The Americans only provide 17% of the HIV money. Yeah, but we provide almost 100% of the surveillance of HIV. You have no idea what's going on in HIV now. How can you control an epidemic if you don't even know where it's breaking out? You can't. And in addition to that, we're the ones that develop the antiretrovirals, which we give to you at cost. So if we don't give it to you at cost, guess what? So the U.S. could do a lot of harm to South Africa overnight if it wanted to. The fact that it hasn't should speak volumes. But Ramaphosa and his ministers are as thick as a box of rocks. They don't get it. They intentionally insult the Americans. This whole thing, sorry to go on here, Johan, but this whole thing is about Trump. It's not about Trump. This predates Trump. It goes back 25 years. This goes back to the Article 98 waiver from the Rome Statute, which South Africa refused to sign, thereby protecting our soldiers. Now, we just stopped doing things with South Africa militarily because we're not going to come there and have you extradite our soldiers on a bogus claim that something happened in Iraq 10 years ago and send them to The Hague for prosecution. So the Article 98 waiver really is when this started in the late 1990s, around 2000. And it's gone on from there. 75% tariffs imposed on our poultry imports to South Africa when we didn't impose any tariffs on your products. And the list goes on the Lady R incident, training Chinese fighter pilots at South African aviation schools using NATO and American pilots. That's not against our interests. Of course it's against our interests. In 2024, during the Biden administration, a bipartisan group of members of the House of Representatives, Democrats, Republicans, put together a bill to re-look the relationship with South Africa strategically with an eye towards sanctioning people. It died during the Biden team. But that should speak volumes that it's not Trump. This predates Trump. But they're obsessed with Trump and saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. Trump knows what he's talking about, and he is trying to avert a genocide. And they lie about him all the time. So it's just really frustrating. But this thing is not going to go well. The U.S. could cripple South Africa overnight. And the BRICS aren't going to come save South Africa. Has China stepped up any aid? No, there's no aid came from China. Has Saudi Arabia? No. Has Brazil? Has India, Russia, China? No. No one's going to save South Africa except South Africans. And if they keep up the nonsense, the hammer's coming. We will not be intimidated. What is that? State of the Nation address supposed to be talking about South Africa's issues, not about, threatening President Trump and this nonsense. So I'll tell you what, Trump has got so many other things on his plate right now. LA riots, he's got Gaza, he's got Ukraine, he's got Democrats, he's got this tax bill, he's got this tiff with Elon Musk. South Africa is way down here. If South Africa were this important to the United States, you would be suffering an embargo right now because of the insults and the actions against U.S. national interests, which the South African politicians refuse to acknowledge. They're the ones that have ruined this relationship, not America. We've given money, we've given blood, we've given toil, we've helped South Africa over and over and over again, and we get people pissing down our leg. And if South Africa actually mattered and was important, like some South Africans think it is, you'd be suffering some serious consequences right now. I mean, that's an honest assessment.
At the same time, Chris, I think the term the Gucci socialist is also true. I read somewhere that Julius Malema said that part of the revolution will be for us to make sure that we become millionaires first, and then we'll smash the whole thing down. I also see that happening. The enrichment of a very, very small group of a really powerful new money elite in South Africa. Powerful is maybe not the right word to use here, but a moneyed political class that has already been created. My question is, how does all of this help me if South Africa becomes more collapsed, if America put the boots down? Because you seem to be working on the other side with politicians that literally do shrug their shoulders and say, well, we don't care. Malema says it quite right from his perspective when he says, well, you take everything away, you've taken everything away in any case. We don't have anything to give away. So we're already poor. So what kind of pressure do you have? What kind of boot can you put on us? I'm speaking as a privileged white man, and I'm seeing my country being destroyed in this whole process. And I'm not quite sure if I see much hope for things to be turned around. Help me out here.
Well, I mean, I think that the problem is this: they're going to eat and eat until it does collapse. They don't care. I mean, look at Joseph Malema. He's never worked a day in his life. He wears Breitling watches that cost $10,000. He's got big, rich suits. He rides around in Land Cruisers. He's never done anything except steal from VBS. Oh, did he do that? I don't know. But we don't know yet. We'll have to find out. Anyway, but no, he's never done anything in his life except run his mouth. And he's a non-entity. He's become increasingly less important. That's why he's squawking all the time now. I predicted that party would never go above 15% in the national election, and they didn't get there in this last election. By the way, I'm going to crow a little bit here. In November of 2021, after municipal elections, I looked at the data across the country, and I predicted the ANC would get 38 to 42% in this most recent election, 2024. The facts changed, but my analysis remained the same because there were countervailing facts that changed as well. And so even the rise of MK, I still said 38 to 42%. And they came in at 40%, 40.18% of the popular vote. And then I also predicted the EFF would go over 10%, which they did. I didn't know there was going to be an MK. That was a develop that came right at the end. But when they did come up, I thought they would get about 10%. They surprised me at 14%. But no, it's look, the whole thing is the edifice is being eaten away, and these politicians don't care because they live in gated communities. They have blue light escorts where they go. They are not victims of crime. And until they become victims of crime, they're not going to care until they suffer. And that suffering will either come from an external actor like the United States, or it will come from an internal insurrection. And here's the thing. So far, they've been able to buy off the media in South Africa, which I mean, look, I watched this thing the other day with this SABC clown interviewing this kid, Peter Creel, with 1,000 followers on YouTube. That doesn't mean he's not consequential, but he's 21 years old. Yeah. He couldn't talk his way out of a hat box, and he's being put on the air as an authority because he tells a narrative that SABC wants to talk about. Look, there are a lot of South Africans who have woken up, black, white, and brown, about what's actually happened in the country. When more and enough of them wake up, they're going to come with the tar and feathers for the likes of Julius Malema and Cyril Ramaphosa. And there ain't going to be a damn thing that the police and the military can do because they're non-functional. Non-functional. We saw that in 2021. And for those paying attention, and I'll tell you this, there are people in South Africa that are ready for this. They're ready for this. And despite the efforts of the government to disarm South Africans, there are people ready for this. And I'm talking about black, white, and brown people that are ready for this coming collapse that may occur. And the first people they're going to go for are those people.
I want to ask you to, first and foremost, you talk about the farm murders and the horrific character of the farm murders. You've worked across Africa. It's also a question I pose to a number of my guests. I spoke to the two daughters of the Hartswater farm murders. So that happened a couple of years ago. I spoke 2 weeks ago to these two ladies who told me their experience, and it's heartbreaking. You have no words to describe the incredible, horrific torture that these people had suffered. In all of your work throughout Africa, have you seen things like the stuff that is happening, the cruelty, the evilness of it all? Have you ever seen that in other African countries as well, or is this unique to the South African experience?
It's not unique to South Africa. I would say before my time, we've seen horrific things like this in the Congo. I have many of my viewers who escaped the Congo. In fact, a couple of them were Belgian, and they were shielded by Moise Tshombe in Katanga, helped them get out before Katanga was reabsorbed by the Congo. We saw these horrific things in the Congo. We saw these horrific things being done to people in Rwanda. That was in my lifetime. We've seen these horrific things being done by jihadists in Somalia, in Nigeria, in the Sahel. And even more gruesome with the French and with the Algerians. We saw it in the Algerian Civil War back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So it's not unique to South Africa, but the torture, the dismemberment, the rapes, the brutal slayings that are taking place.
Throwing boiling water down the throats of a child.
Throwing a child in the bathtub and dropping an electrical appliance in there to electrocute an infant, raping a father in front of his daughters and wife, and then raping them, and castrating a man in front of his family. This is what's happened in South Africa. And no, I haven't seen anything to that degree. I've lived all over Africa and I've not seen that sort of hatred. But it's not hatred in my view. It's domestic terrorism intended to frighten people off the land. That's what it's all about. And that's what's happening here. When we see people with cell phone jammers and we see people with police issued sidearms cutting through fences on closed circuit television, attacking farmers, this is not ordinary crime. This is not revenge for mistreated farm workers. This is syndicates working on behalf of someone to achieve a strategic goal. And the goal is to frighten people off the land for whatever reason, whatever the intent is. And that's exactly what happened here. They beat that man, but the intent wasn't to kill him. They left him, beaten and subdued. I mean, who ties up a 70-some-year-old wheelchair-bound man and then beats him by 5 able-bodied men who are armed? What's the purpose of that? That's not a house robbery. That's domestic terrorism, and that's exactly what it is. And the fact that it's not described as such and it's covered up as a house robbery shows you the collusion of the government. And the White House is aware of this. So, here's another thing. I want to talk about this really quickly before we wrap up, is that this whole obsession with diminishing the suffering of these people. I know the Braun family, what happened to them. I know them personally. I know several other families who have survived this sort of thing. And this is just horrific. I mean, this callous disregard for the people suffering. Well, it's just crime. And they tried that in the White House. It's not just crime. And it's not about a white genocide. Who talks about a white genocide? News 24, IOL, South African politicians. I don't see credible people in the center on the right going around screaming white genocide. There is a genocide taking place in South Africa, and it's on the path to wiping out a people, and that's cultural genocide of the Afrikaans language.
How did you feel? How did you feel when John Steenhuisen said, "We have crime and it affects all people"?
Yeah, John Steenhuisen. How did I feel? I'll reserve my comment about him personally because there's something going on here that I'm not revealing. But I think John Steenhuisen is a bought and paid for part of the government of national unity. He should have resigned as leader of the DA and been a minister, or he should have stayed leader of the DA and let someone else be the agriculture minister. He can't serve two masters. He's serving the president, and that's fine. That's what he was doing in that role, even though it's a lie. It's not about crime. It's like the refugee program. All this back to this rubbishing people. All these people are privileged. They get to go. Why do they get to go? Everyone's a victim of crime. The refugee program isn't about crime. It's also, as I said from the beginning, not about farmers. It's also not about white people. It's also not about Afrikaners. All of these lies were told to diminish, as if white people, Afrikaners, and farmers don't deserve equal treatment under the law. That's basically what they're saying. The bottom line is that the refugee program was established for initially Afrikaners, and as I projected and hoped it would be for racial minorities, for those suffering unjust racial discrimination. Whether you're a victim of crime isn't germane. It can be if you're a victim of racial crime. Whether you're a farmer isn't germane. The fact that all these news outlets say, oh, they weren't all farmers. Who cares? It's not about farmers. It's not about farmers. And this is, and the same thing with these killings. It's dismissing these killings. It's clear what's going on here. It's been like this for years. I mean, they banned Lauren Southern from coming back to the country after a documentary. They banned Katie Hopkins from back to the country. And all they did was tell the truth. When you're afraid of the truth, you're not legitimate. And that's the bottom line here. That's what's happening. And it's so frustrating. Look, I've never denied that all South Africans suffer from horrific crime. Never denied it. In fact, I'm one of the few journalists that actually reports on it. Anytime I hear about a black South African that gets in the media, or especially on a farm, I report on it. I reported extensively about the murder of Sefeho Safatso, the 9-month pregnant, beautiful Tswana woman who was hung from a tree and murdered on a contract paid for hire killing because her boyfriend found her inconvenient. I'm also the one that reported endlessly on the UCT student who was murdered by the mail clerk. But I also reported on what happened to Hannah, what's her name there, that was murdered down in the Cape. I'm drawing a blank right now. But my point is that I cover all these equally. All life matters. But they're dismissing this because, as I believe, it's part of something bigger here. The fact that there are, well, I don't want to go into that. I won't go there because I don't want to make that allegation without some evidence of it. I've got some evidence, but I'm not going to put that on the table right now. But the bottom line is that this effort to diminish these things, this is all propaganda war. And the propaganda war has been won from 2000 until 2025 by the leftists who've lied about South Africa. But Donald Trump, whether he intended to or not, has pulled the veil back. And people who are cogent, people who are objective, people who are rational and fair are looking at this in a very different lens right now. And that's not good for South Africa.
If I'm to ask you to put on the hat of the information officer, and you are to brief President Donald Trump today, what will be the bottom line of your briefing? Will I be correct if I say that the potential of the ignition of some nasty event is a great probability in South Africa?
Well, if I were the person briefing the president, if I was his briefer, I would tell him that South Africa is on a knife edge and that the United States needs to be prepared to potentially intervene in something in Southern Africa if this goes south. And I could describe a bunch of different scenarios where I could go. Also, that nothing is going to change for the better in South Africa until the ANC is convinced that the world is paying attention and they can't get away with what they've been doing. The Democratic Alliance seems obsessed with simply being part of government. I don't know if it's because some of their ministers like having perks. I don't know. I'm not going to make that claim. They've been nothing but a disappointment here. They've stood up the whole time, no, 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 in opposition, and now they don't say no to anything in office, and it's led to horrific outcomes. We haven't even talked about the National Health Insurance Initiative, which is coming. That's going to destroy healthcare in South Africa. I was seen by 3 medical professionals on short notice. All of them, by the way, offered the services free because I was having a hip problem in 3 different provinces in South Africa. It was very generous of these people to see me. I was very kind to them. I didn't ask. They offered. And here I come back here for military care and have to wait 6 weeks to see my general practitioner. But the point of the story is that in South Africa, where I was going with this, is a very generous country with very generous people, black, white, and brown. And I think that black, white, and brown South Africans can live together and still develop separately. You can still be a Khoi, but interact with folks and go to university and go to school and still protect your Khoi language or your San language or your Afrikaans language. But things are not looking good. And I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer or a gloomy Gus, but the bottom line here is that nothing is going to change for the better. This fund that they want to create, that Parks Tao wants to put together to uplift black businesses, you do so at the cost of everyone. Why isn't that a program made available? Why do we not have a program if we're going to take 3% of the money from corporations and their profit and put into a fund? Why can't it be for any entrepreneur or business that's trying to grow South Africa? Why can it only be for blacks? That's racist, and it harms everybody. It harms everybody. So it's not going to get better unless external. So if I was briefing President Trump, I'd tell him all of this. I'd also tell him that that you shouldn't fall for the smoke and mirrors. It's utter nonsense. Just stick to your points, tell people the truth, and you didn't ask me if I had any recommendations for him, and I'd rather not say my recommendations. I've kind of alluded to some of the things that President Trump can do, but I don't want people to claim that I'm the one pushing for this. Someone tried to pull that nonsense.
I was going to, if you allow me,
Yeah.
I was going to ask you that in fact, as a last question is,
Okay.
if you are to sit with President Trump and say, well, there are ways in which we can actually turn the direction of this ship, what would those recommendations be? That's one part of the question, if you don't mind. The other part is, if things do ignite, if it really goes really down, is America in some way capable of intervening and assisting in ways that would give some of us hope?
Well, my recommendation would be for a high-level delegation to quietly go to South Africa, meet with President Ramaphosa, his defense minister, Anju Mocheka, his national security advisor, and his senior members of the cabinet, and have a frank conversation. Here's the bottom line. We see what's going on here. We're not happy about it. You are a sovereign nation, but your actions have impinged upon our sovereignty in many respects. And therefore, here's the facts. You have 2 operational Gripens and 1 qualified pilot. We have 3,700 fighter planes. You have 1 operational cruiser. We have 400 ship Navy. You have no operational submarines. We have 45 nuclear submarines. We have 1.3 million troops on active duty. SWIFT banking system could turn you off tonight. We import $430 million worth of minerals, which employ X number of people in South Africa. That can stop tomorrow. Now, you can continue to be a sovereign nation, do what you want. This is a private conversation, by the way. This wouldn't be something that would be shared with the public.
Mhm.
But if you continue to act against U.S. interests and continue to do what you're doing, then there will be consequences because you've gotten a free ride for 25 years while we look the other way. We're not looking the other way now. And if you think you can ride this out until there's another president in the office, Trump has 3.5 years left.
I was
Your
going to say
economy,
exactly that. I was going to say
your,
exactly
your,
that.
your economy will collapse before the next president comes in. Now, unless you want people, attacking your politicians' homes, you might want to consider making some changes. And here's a couple recommendations. Get rid of BEE tomorrow. Abolish it. Make it happen. And then we can talk again. And if you want aid, we can resume aid. We can give you the carrot too. Doesn't have to be a stick. Now, not in these terms necessarily, but I'm saying that's the gist of the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the bottom line is that the ANC's gotten away with what they want to do for so long that they think they're untouchable. And the reality is, I don't think they realize just how fragile South Africa is, or they don't care. But they're also fragile, and there are consequences. So, anyway, like for instance, the fact that Julius Malema is walking around free. I mean, frankly, if I were in the Justice Department, I would issue an international warrant for his arrest for threatening President Trump's life. He did that. He threatened President Trump and Elon Musk's life a few months ago. And frankly, South Africa has an obligation to extradite him, But I mean, I'm just saying that's an example of things that could be done. So anyway, that's one of the suppositions I put up there when the UK denied his visa. I said, well, they did him a favor. People said, why did they do him a favor? I said, there's probably an arrest warrant with his name on it that's sealed right now. And if he went to the UK, they'd have to hand him over to the Americans. I think the UK did him a favor, not let leave South Africa. But anyway, no, I would send a discreet high level team to South Africa and have this conversation and none of this pussyfooting around. None of this, diplomatic stuff. The time for diplomacy is over. We've been insulted enough. The Lady R incident, a sanctioned Russian ship. Now, to be fair, not sanctioned by South Africa, but sanctioned by the entire Western world in the middle of a conflict, travels to South Africa in the dark of night at Simonstown. Everybody and their brother, I've stayed in a hotel up there looking down on Simontown's naval base, is taking pictures and video of these BMWs and Mercedes from the Special Forces unit up in Bloemfontein down there, and with the license plates and number plates, and the crates coming off the container, then another one being loaded on, all done in the dark of night. The U.S. discreetly asked Johan for 5 months with Ambassador Briggity for a response diplomatically, and we were ignored completely ignored by the ANC. And finally, Washington told Reuben Briggity, go public with it. Tell the world that they gave weapons to the Russians. And, of course, the argument was, well, Briggity's wrong. He's lying. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But here's the thing. Was Reuben Briggity relieved as ambassador? Was he recalled? No. Why wasn't he recalled? I know Reuben Briggity. I work for him at Addis Ababa. He's a very political creature. He would do nothing to risk his future political ambitions in the Democratic Party. He'll do exactly what he's told to do, and that's what he did. He did what Washington told him to do, and he wasn't relieved and sent home because he did their bidding to expose the ANC and Lady R. And they did a sham cover-up investigation, which they appointed some judge and said, now this is after they ignored the public, then ignored the Americans. For 5 months, we asked politely, diplomatically, it's time for those gloves to come off. And look, these conversations can all take place behind closed doors, so nobody's feelings are hurt. There's no reason to embarrass the politicians in South Africa, but if they keep it up, it's not going to go well.
Thank you very much for this talk.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to come on. And before we go to that, if I could just say that the following. I have a great affinity for South Africa and for South Africans. It's an absolutely, truly amazing country full of amazing people. I just interviewed a 92-year-old last first language speaker of the Nu language, but it's pronounced Nu. No, I can't do it very well because it's a sign language. Amazing lady trying to save her language with another generation. Afrikaners, Xhosa, Venda, Zulu, Basotho, it's Swazi. It doesn't matter. Zulu. South Africans are truly amazing people. Most of whom believe in faith, family, and flag in whatever context that is. They just want to raise their kids. They want to have a better future for their kids. They want to live their life in peace. But politics has truly screwed up South Africa for a century, and certainly for the past 40 years. People need to find a way out of this morass. And I have nothing but the best of hope for South Africa and for South Africans. And what I would love to see is the diaspora be able to return home to a peaceful, prosperous South Africa that's based not on race, but based on merit. And that's what South Africa needs. And with that, I want to thank you once again for having me on. It's been my pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very, very much.